All right, so a question that a lot of people have for 21st Talks that I see a lot of people who are not super familiar with the field of existential risk and global catastrophic risks ask is the question of, well, what do we do after we know about these risks and hazards? Like, what use is it knowing about nuclear weapons and their history and specific ways we can try and mitigate them if there isn't any underlying understanding of how to get countries to work together, how to get international corporations to work together, international organizations, states to engage with these findings? And today's two guests are incredibly telling to what solutions there are. We had a wonderful discussion with Luke Kemp and Catherine Rhodes. Luke is a current researcher at CSER, which is Cambridge's Existential Risk Institute, one of my favorite organizations in the history of humanity. And Catherine Rhodes was the executive director of CSER. The previous executive director, and both of them are experts in international cooperation. Catherine being an expert within advanced technological risks, primarily biological, and also interstate cooperation, how to make sure we don't die from synthetic biology and all of these really advanced sort of technological risks, while also still being able to reap the benefits of research into those really scary and dangerous technologies. Whereas Luke is more focused on climate change and acknowledging and really knowing where to focus our efforts in terms of changing our current existential risk landscape. Understanding what organizations and individuals and places are the most responsible. And he released a recent article on BBC Futures called Agents of Doom that I highly suggest reading. I'll drop a link in the description. But without any further ado, apart from our classic, please remember to like, rate, and subscribe. Pitch in a few dollars on Patreon if you can. It helps really support the podcast and everything we're doing here at 21st Talks. Big thanks to Nathaniel Cook, one of my really good friends in the field and co-host for this episode. I'm really excited to do more episodes with you in the future. And nonetheless, I really want to thank you all once again for supporting 21st Talks. We're really seeing some really great engagement and growth in these discussions about effective altruism and existential risk. So here is our interview with Catherine Rhodes and Luke Kemp on global catastrophic disasters and how to govern them. Thank you all so much. I'll see you guys next week. What are the forces, challenges, and ideas that define the 21st century? Conversations to understand the greatest figures and stories of today to create a better tomorrow. This is the 21st Talks podcast. Start. Hell yeah. Well, hi everybody, and welcome back to this episode of the 21st Talks podcast. I'm joined today with Catherine Rhodes, as well as Luke Kemp and Nathaniel Cook. How's everyone doing today?
Yeah, good, thank you.
Yes, very well.
Good to hear. Catherine, can you tell us a little bit about your work, and like what work you did at CSER when you're working back there with Luke, as well as the other sort of work that you're doing today?
Yeah, sure. So I think with CSER, it was really quite broad because I was in a sort of management role. So I got to be involved in lots of different bits and pieces. But my own research is sort of focused on international governance and biosecurity issues. So biological risks quite broadly, but also trying to then take lessons from what I know of governance in that area and how that might apply to other areas of existential risk. And the connection with Luke is we sort of jointly wrote what was called a cartography of catastrophe governance, I think. So trying to match up the different sections of expertise we had in terms of different areas of global governance, the different risks, into a form of mapping of what's going on.
Yeah. And then how long ago were you guys working on that project? 2 years?
Yeah, I think about 2 years. Yeah.
Gotcha. So right around the same time that Nathaniel was also working with Luke on a separate project there.
Yeah.
Is that right, Luke?
Approximately.
You just had a handful of different existential risk projects going on at that time, Luke, didn't you? Then, Luke, what work are you doing now?
Yeah, so my work focuses on a few different areas. One is climate change, particularly thinking about the kind of worst risks of climate change. So we have a few different projects going on there, including trying to put forward both a set of concerns as to why we should take climate change seriously as both an existential and a global catastrophic risk, and also a research agenda for how you exactly you'd study it. A separate kind of body of work I'm looking at is looking at the kind of the methodological underpinnings of how we study existential risk and how to both critique them and improve them. And then the majority of my work at this moment is focusing upon societal transformation and collapse, and in a way thinking about how states die and how they kill, but it's also a much deeper look at kind of how power hierarchies potentially produce risks over time, including through to the modern day. And prior to that, a lot of my work with Catherine was on biological security, both looking at dual use research concern as well as bioengineering, both of which we've conducted horizon scans on.
Wow, okay. So when it came to this question of looking at global governance and its intersection with existential threats, obviously the parallel with the like COP26 happening right now, and both of your guys' backgrounds when it comes to your interest in existential risks and focuses, there's a lot of major overlap. What has this last like few days been like? Like, have you guys like been keeping up with the different news and stuff coming out of it? Are you generally feeling pretty pessimistic, pretty optimistic about some of the international conversations that we've been hearing out of? It's happening in Scotland right now, isn't it, or is it in Ireland?
Glasgow, Scotland.
Glasgow. But nonetheless, like, how is that, like, as people who studied existential risks and especially governance, like, what has it been like the last few days?
I mean, I'm happy to leave that mostly to Luke. I don't follow as closely the environment and climate change areas of governance, except for, a few things on Twitter. It's obviously there at the moment.
Yeah, so I spent approximately a decade being involved with the UN climate negotiations. A large part of my PhD focused upon being involved in international environmental negotiations. At this stage, I'm fairly pessimistic insofar as I think that unless you change either the underlying geopolitics, then there's not really going to be that much that's going to happen for the existing Paris Agreement. And that architecture is largely locked in place. Most of the issues that are being discussed right now are fairly minor, so things like transparency, market-based mechanisms. I don't think those are going to be the key to unlocking where we reach 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees. And the good news that's coming out of Glasgow right now is mainly things that are, in a way, adjacent to the negotiations. So primarily the announcement of new pledges, particularly pledges around net zero targets. So this is basically targets different countries are putting forward for when they're going to reach net zero emissions. There's a couple of key things to note here, and this kind of underpins my cynicism. One is that net zero means not that you reduce your emissions to zero, but rather the balance between sequestration and emissions means that overall it's zero. So most targets have a heavier reliance upon what are called negative emissions. So in some way drawing down carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. The problem is we only have small prototypes of actually doing this, and we don't actually know if they can work at scale. And the other big issue, of course, is that these commitments are neither legally binding and they're also very far in the future. And we know from essentially every bit of economic modeling done that the biggest issue when it comes to climate change and the biggest factor in terms of both the cost of meeting a target and the likelihood of meeting a target is delay. And so if these targets are being used as ways to basically justify and procrastinate, they're not that helpful in terms of actually meeting the decarbonization challenge. But nonetheless, it has been in some ways uplifting to see how quickly the discourse has changed, where many countries wouldn't have even thought about putting forward a net zero target a few years ago.
Yeah, I guess it's strange because I think for Nathaniel and I and people in our age range, which makes up majority of the people who listen to this, climate change has just kind of been over our heads our entire lives, So it's always interesting to talk with people who, obviously as someone who hopes to study existential risk one day and do the formal research and stuff myself, there's these kind of like two parallel like lines of experience with it, right? There's like the academic and like ERS type like analysis and sort of like interest in governments, and there's the focus in terms of like just like the heart of it and just like the actual sort of genuine fear and genuine sort of like feelings of growing up in that and just living in that world. And I think that has guided a lot of people to existential risk and to study it. Which we'll probably talk about a little bit later if we have time, about your guys' sort of personal reasons for doing this. But I wanted to ask Catherine, a lot of your work, you said, focuses in advanced technological risks, specific like biosecurity, right? And can you talk about why you decided to go with that? in terms of like it seems to be pretty heavily like neglected when it comes to a lot of different risks. It seems like biosecurity is one of the ones that you don't exactly hear about like when you're talking with people about what they're worried about. So can you tell us a little bit more about like why you decided to do that and its overlap and parallel with like government?
Yeah, sure. And I think part of the answer is it's almost the other way around, in that I started in that field in biosecurity and moved later to existential risk. So I think, so my PhD was focusing on trying to understand, in terms of the international system, all the different areas in which biotechnology is governed. So looking at trade, environment, agriculture, intellectual property rights, and seeing how all that would interact with the Biological Weapons Convention. So, is this stuff going to be supportive of what states are trying to do in the Biological Weapons Convention? Might some of it be in tension with that? And so that's where I started. And I think so that was getting on for 20 years ago, but it's maybe 6 years since I moved into the existential risk space specifically. So I think it's hard to answer the question, if I was starting off in existential risk, is this what I would have focused on more than this is the sort of knowledge and expertise I bring with me and therefore is my main focus. And like I say, then trying to take that across to helping people understand what that might imply for governance of other technologies.
Yeah, can you tell us a little bit more about that? Because I know the Biological Weapons Convention was it 72? It was like the early 70s. And I don't know exactly the significance that it brought to sort of effectively implementing these issues, because it seems like a lot of what Luke is talking about as well is like, in terms of climate change, is the implementation is a significantly different task in terms of mitigating X risks, right? The actual effective thing to do versus just like the handshakes and like, pats on the back that we, see photo ops of. So can you tell us a little bit more about like the actual sort of like substantive changes that have happened when it comes to biological weapons, as well as just like synthetic biology or other sort of like really major pressing issues after the convention in 72?
Sure. So I think one place to start is trying to work out whether, so the convention essentially its core is a prohibition on misusing, using for hostile purposes, biology and the biological sciences. And there certainly have been far fewer biological weapons programs since that prohibition has been in place than there had been. There not been massive numbers before. But I think the question in mind is whether, particularly the more powerful states, had already decided for other reasons that they would drop those programs and therefore brought the convention into place, or whether it's the other way around. So it's probably a mix of those two. So the normative value of that prohibition is felt to have been strong. There is still a taboo. There may well be a few states having biological warfare programs, but they're not going to openly admit that. There would, if it could be proven that a state had a biological warfare program, there are then mechanisms to be used through the UN Security Council. There is action that can be taken. There's also like complementary rules. There's one called the 1540 Committee of the Security Council that look at the kind of proliferation aspects as well. So the from states to non-state actors dimension.
Yeah. And I know some of your work is focused on gain of function research as well, and specifically prohibitions versus potential effective uses of that. There was I think a Future of Life podcast episode in like 2018 or 2018 I think, with Ariel Khan, I believe, where you discuss just that prospect. And I know that the Chinese researcher who did some potential ethical mishaps and international legal mishaps. So are we starting to see the frequency of people overstepping these 30, 40-year-old long sort of biological technology tendencies and laws or rules or soft rules or however you want to put it? Are we starting to see more and more instances of people overstepping them in terms of researchers and less respect for the sort of international, or are you pretty confident about the course of international legislation on these things?
Yeah, so it's less that anyone's overstepping the mark. Again, in terms of it very much has to be that you are intending to do this research for hostile purposes. The thing is more to do with the fact that the research that you can do for peaceful purposes can easily be converted. So this is where this dual use research concept comes in. And so I think the reason why there's sort of increased concern around things like advanced gene editing, CRISPR, things like that, is that they open up that potential capacity more. So that could be either for a state in that it could more rapidly build up a program with more, could probably get a more effective biological weapon through these more advanced techniques than previously. And then it's a second concern is, does this mean that this expands the range of actors so it wouldn't just be states that you'd be worried about?
Which I think brings us on to the main thread that I really wanted to hear a larger discussion about. And that's the question of, is it the technology itself that is posing the risk, or is it the state apparatus it's working within, or the sort of economic system underpinning that, or like where exactly is this risk coming from in terms of biotechnology specifically, and then more broadly, the larger risk landscape? Luke, I know your recent piece, Agents of Doom on BBC, incredibly wonderful read. It will be linked down below. I also am hopefully going to be publishing a review of it soon, which is going to be pretty fun. So don't worry, it won't be scathing whatsoever. It'll just mostly be just me going, yeah, that's fair. But I wanted to get both of you guys' takes on this question of like government and whether or not you think our current sort of systems in place are the reason why our risk landscape is looking so dire today. Because it's scary. It's a really scary place to be at this point in human history. And I want to know to what extent you guys sort of attribute to that sort of larger governmental system, and to what you extend and sort of focus on just the technology alone. Because technological bans versus like government change, I feel like are two massively different sort of approaches to reducing the risk landscape. So I wanted to open the floor to all three of you.
Cool.
That's a huge question.
I can have a go first. I think Luke is going to agree with this, having also read his Agents of Doom piece and discussed things with him. But yeah, I have a very rapid response to that sort of question about risk coming from technology and coming from how we use it. It's predominantly the latter. It's human choices, maybe scaled to a system level, but it's our choices to develop particular technologies, to apply them in particular ways, and to set the rules and norms that go around them. And then you couple that with the social, economic, political context, which also can drive technology towards particular ends, lock in particular pathways, and determine who benefits and that sort of thing. To me, it's like technology doesn't just suddenly appear and kind of drop down. It's something we create and construct and shape, and we can do a lot better in how we choose to shape and use it.
Yeah, and obviously I agree entirely with that sentiment. When you look empirically at how different existential hazards have been created in the past, it's quite clear these weren't just random constructions. They required very large amounts of resources, both in terms of personnel, skills, training, just actual sheer economic resources. They usually required a large amount of secrecy as well. And these kinds of things, it's kind of summarized by the actual idea of a Manhattan Project, right? Like the way we use the term Manhattan Project, which arguably was the kind of first existential hazard we had created, or epidemic existential hazard, it literally conjures this idea of a massive state building project, and one that requires, again, secrecy and is projected towards a military purpose. So, and there's an interesting question, of course, and Catherine alluded to this earlier, of does this change in the future? Will we have a much larger range of actors who have access to creating either vulnerabilities or hazards that could lead to global catastrophe? And there's a potential for that, but I think the interesting thing is that even that will be driven by a very particular kind of political economy and a very particular set of power networks. The bigger question to me is, of course, what incentivizes these particular structures, and can we build around them? Can we build something new? And I think so far the field has usually had this very techno-determinist mindset. And this, of course, isn't all scholars. I think it's just more of a general trend that most scholars seem to think that these are technologies that are always going to get built, whether it's due to the international system or due to human nature or something else. Personally, I just don't think that's true. It's just we can organize society in so many different ways, and there's no need to accept that society has to be politically constructed in such a way that we must build all technologies possible, and we must build the most strategically dangerous ones as well.
to
Nathaniel,
expand.
do you, any of the questions that? Yeah. Oh, sorry. No, you can go, Nathaniel.
I was just, I guess, to expand and solidify on that point. Like, this is a question to both of you. To what extent can these kinds of taking into account the whole risk landscape? Can you do you have a feel for how much of this can be put down to the actions, the choices of either individuals or groups, or like your agents of doom, Luke, versus more impersonal, sort of societal or game theoretic forces, drivers, whatever you want to call them?
Yeah, I mean, it's a
That was a
very
long time.
complex question. And again, I'll have a go first. I think one of the interesting things when looking at how, particularly again, looking at how the risks around dual use research are being governed is there is an increasing emphasis on what is it that individual scientists do? Are they responsible about their research? And I mean, it's fair to expect responsibility by individuals, but you also then again question how much that individual can actually change any of this larger landscape. Why are they being driven to research in certain areas? What are the kind of standards that affect how they work and what their practices are, and these sorts of things. So that doesn't kind of, and I wouldn't say this just lets us all off the hook as individuals. So I would say in those sorts of cases, it's actually asking ourselves, well, how much then do we understand those sort of dynamics and how they affect our work? So if you, as a scientist, feel I am producing something that's really good, it's going to really benefit humanity, but it never gets there, it never gets to the people who need it or this sort of thing, then you should also be trying to understand why not, and maybe interacting with that not. Is there something you can do to change that? So it doesn't let us off the hook, but I think it's much less the kind of down to the average individual. So again, Luke will, I guess, bring up something different in the context of agents of doom, but yeah, it's much less down to your average individual than it is down to the systems.
I agree with Catherine. This is a really complex and difficult to answer question. And to me, it's partly because the incentives and the structure are at least partly determined by the power networks themselves. So yes, particular countries and military industrial complexes face particular incentives that make them more likely to engage in something like an arms race. But ultimately, they are also usually the ones who benefit from it and are reinforcing the structure as well. I'd be far more forgiving of the fossil fuel industry if once they heard about climate change, they were like, okay, fair enough. We'll work with you to kind of decarbonize and make sure that we make as much profit at the same time as possible. But of course, they didn't do that. The opposite. They tried to actually actively bury information that had been dating back to the 70s and 80s on climate science and tried to discredit the science. And so when your agents and when these power networks are actually benefiting from the status quo, they take a very strong role in ensuring that it is reinforced, becomes a positive feedback loop of sorts. So I think it's difficult to disentangle the actual kind of power networks from the incentives because they're constantly being molded and reinforced by the power networks themselves. And you end up, I think, with the same intervention point is really changing the way that power is distributed, rather than worrying about whether this is some kind of like meta structural problem that we can't solve.
So you're saying the direct actors who are benefiting from it are one the same with the ones who most often are like perpetuating the risk itself, right? And this creates a feedback loop of like incentive and also like power to like drive incentive and also the power to like actually effectuate change. And that causes this larger context of systems that are producing existential risk actors and like situations not really changing and kind of stagnating, and if not anything, getting worse. What does that like? What are effective changes that we can make in terms of? I think bringing it back to biosecurity would be a really, really wonderful aspect here. How can policy researchers, technological experts, and people who are affecting like policy change actually get better sort of communication between them to effectively have like stronger ties and like actual sort of like communities of people who are aware of these things who each can play their role in changing the underlining like system and the underlying like sort of policy that we need to bring about? Because I know, Catherine, when you were executive director at Caesar, A lot of that work was working with researchers of technology and researchers of policy, and trying to figure out exactly how we can like work together as a global community and also as individuals within that global community to effectively manage and mitigate global risks. What was that like? Like, that just seems incredibly disheartening. Like, in terms of the amount of work that we have to actually bring about in terms of getting experts to talk to one another and getting it to actually effectively bring about change. So, like, could you speak on any of those points?
Yeah, I mean, again, another big question. No, it wasn't kind of that depressing or frustrating kind of being in that context. I mean, what you do have is a lot of very motivated, very engaged researchers who really care about what they're doing and are trying to make a difference. So that's good. I think also for me, it's not necessarily seeing it as a kind of it's just the existential risk community working on these issues, because so often it will align with something else that's going on. So, I mean, again, take climate change, the amount of activism that's growing around that. Even if it's not focused on the most extreme scenarios, if that activism can get some action that does help us to, reduce those risks, then that's also good. So I think it's not feeling that we're alone. So maybe it is part of it is connecting with these other communities that are doing aligned work, who may not identify themselves as such, but that's important. I'm not sure how far that goes in answering the question of what it is we kind of do. But yeah, I think seeing that we are part of some bigger things is going to help.
Yeah, absolutely, because there's a larger collective mission there that people are working on. And I'm really, really happy. When I said disheartening, I meant in terms of like relation to like a very large system that's producing risks. Because I've heard from multiple different researchers, and now this has only been further substantiated by what you just said, that the more you engage in the field, specifically with the people in the field, and also your own work, if you like have a healthy sense of like really trying to do something with it, it creates this like sense of optimism, not optimism, but like rational like hope almost. And it creates like actual substantive reasons to like hold on to and like continue to fight for change and continue to fight for like human flourishing and survival this century and ahead. And I just like I'm really, really happy about you bringing that up, because I think that's the value of one of the emotional values of the existential risk community and being engaged in it, because it's really counterintuitive, isn't it? It feels like when you say these things, it would like make you more sad. No, it has always only made me more happy, Yeah,
and I think so. One of the interesting things as well is that we, and I take this broadly, not just existential risk researchers, I think we have a conception that in the technological and scientific domains, we can be forever innovative and transformative. Then in the kind of social, political, economic structures that we can't be. And both, sort of going back to my answer earlier, both are kind of socially constructed things. Therefore, yes, it can be a bit dismaying that there's a huge kind of system change that's going to be needed, but we're humans, right? We created these systems, so we're going to be the ones who have a chance of recreating them.
Yeah, and again, I entirely agree with that. I think what you're alluding to, Coleman, reminds me of Gramsci's idea of, what is it? Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. And it's sometimes difficult to look at the existential risk situation, not feel, of course, some degree of pessimism. But as Kevin mentioned, like when you actually think of everything that we're capable of doing and the myriad different flexible ways that we're capable of organizing ourselves, it really doesn't seem beyond our powers collectively or individually, or even as individual societies, to reshape the way we conduct ourselves and into ways which are both more conducive to human flourishing, but also just produce less risk. And to me, this is all about thinking about existential risk in quite a different way, where so far the field has been quite hazard-centric, and the typical way of thinking about risk, of course, is hazard, vulnerability, exposure. But most recently, particularly in the latest assessment report of the IPCC, they've added a new determinant there, which is response. So thinking about hazard, vulnerability, response, exposure. And I think even deeper than that is underlying all four of those risk determinants is drivers. And to me, this is really thinking about what are the socio-political or economic drivers that create different risks, whether it's biosecurity, climate, etc., etc. And once you understand the drivers, you know how to cut to the heart of risk. And that seems quite important, because if you are trying to think about this long term, it doesn't matter so much if you address a particular hazard if the driver is still operating and producing new ones in the long term.
Yeah. When it comes to, so I know more recent research in existential risk and the sort of larger global catastrophic risk community has also talked a lot more about sort of cascading system failure and these sort of larger like coupled systems and our need to decouple them. So I feel like it's not unfair to say that the entire risk landscape, it needs to be seen as like a sort of just amalgamation of all the risks we're facing. How do you researchers from both of your guys' understanding grapple with the fact that they can research and become an expert in a specific hazard, in a specific like existential risk like approach, and still have a massive amount of risks over here and hazards over here, I mean, that they haven't spent time studying that could intimately affect and are definitely coupled to the same systems and the same sort of dangerous areas than that their risk is, right? Because it almost feels like I can spend some time studying X, Y, or Z, let's say the case of like artificial intelligence, but then there's this massive broad amount of like other hazards that are existentially dangerous. So is calling it like a web of existential risk work a good way to think about it? Like, is that one of the reasons why the community matters so much? Is like you have faith and you not even faith, demonstrated like rational reasons to see or to believe that other people are really, really working on these other issues. Because I feel like the more you're engaged in that, the sort of more confidence you get, that sort of optimism of the will.
So yeah, I think you're answering the question in the way I would have. So yeah, that within the community, you want people working and having expertise in different ways, so that yes, you would have the kind of inputs from people who maybe have a very specific knowledge of specific risks, but also the people who know how to join those things together, who know about systems approaches, who understand complexity. And it's one of those interesting ones. I don't know what sort of syllabus I would set out if you were going to do a kind of like undergraduate existential risk course, because there are so many different disciplines and approaches and bits that can feed into it. So I guess part of it for me is making sure that community does seem open to as many different kind of disciplines. If someone out there is kind of working in one area thinking, I've got a way that I can contribute to this, then there is a way for them to come in and do so.
Yeah. Can we can shift gears a little bit to talking and leaning more specifically into the governance and current blind spots of ERS and existential risk work more broadly.
Before we do that, I actually just want to quickly add to Catherine's point that
please do.
I think there's actually value to rethinking the way we conceptualize risk when it comes to existential risk, because implicitly we're often still thinking about hazards and joining together hazards, and we're still thinking about these kind of questions of, is this thing an existential risk? Is climate change an existential risk? Is AGI an existential risk? And the more you look at it, the more I'm convinced that this is a fundamentally flawed way of trying to think about existential risk, that climate change could lead to human extinction depending upon a whole range of variables, including things which aren't necessarily related to climate change. So the level of inequality in the world, the level of political coordination, the different dangerous technologies and weaponry that is available in case climate change spurs conflict. And likewise, if you think of geoengineering, efforts to actually fix the climate or offset its impacts through large-scale interventions in the Earth system, whether something like stratospheric aerosol injection, pumping up things like sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere to reflect sunlight, whether that ends up being catastrophic is incredibly dependent upon if it's done in a collective, coordinated fashion, the level of loading done, so the actual amount of climate change we're facing, a whole bunch of other things which are kind of like separate to the actual geoengineering event itself. So I don't think you can think about individual hazards anymore. You're much better thinking about what's the overall level of risk we're facing given a particular structural or kind of socio-political system. So it's much more thinking about risk as being an emergent behavior rather than a set of disparate risks or hazards.
And underlying that are those drivers that you mentioned previously. And could we just get, like, I mean, maybe this is pretty informal, but off the top of your head, like, what are your top 5 existential risk drivers of all time?
I'll let Catherine go first because it's a hard question.
Really interested in how they differ.
I don't think I'm going to come up with 5. I guess, again, with the focus more on the international governance side of things, it is things like the continued focus on this sort of concept of short-term economic competitiveness, a continued reversion to a very narrowly kind of conceived notion of national interest. So there are those particular things that I think are key drivers there and why we're failing to govern properly. So we often get there in principle, and I think this is probably speaks to some of my attitude to that very first question about, well, not very first, but about COP26. We're very good about the principle, about coming out with the statements, the pledges. It's that translation into action that doesn't happen, and I think that is because of some of these drivers.
Yeah, I mean, this is an enormous question, and one that I can't answer with any very high degree of certainty. So part of my research into collapse and transformation is really an attempt to think through, in a historical context, what are the different dynamics that tend to lead to catastrophe. And one that stands out quite obviously is something like, you can call it rivals dynamics or competition between different power hierarchies, but essentially that states and different existing, what I like to call power sites, basically like networks of parasitic power, tend to be quite competitive. And that leads to things like, colonization, arms races, etc. But it's also more complicated than that because, states, whilst they often compete militarily, often cooperate in very strange ways, even when they're supposed to be competing. So if you look at the Pegasus project, for instance, from the NSO, that's by an Israeli outfit, and yet they were mainly hiring it out to countries that were the direct enemies of Israel, like the UAE, for instance. And you have this all the time in the military-industrial complex where there's weapons that are produced often a government contract for a particular government, and then they're sold to the enemies of that government. And to me, that's become something that is less about kind of competitive dynamics and much more about something along the lines of like, I don't know, self-interest, profit motive, extractive impulse, whatever you will, of hierarchies. And then potentially there's something just here of like, at least in my worldview, if humans individually aren't that bad, if we actually, our nature is pretty fundamentally good, why is it that when we tend to organize ourselves into hierarchies, we tend to end up with things like slavery and arms race, etc.? And so maybe there's something to do with power corrupting there as well. And then I think last but not least would be something along the lines of environmental externalities. The fact that we socially have distanced ourselves so far from our environment and codified that in the economic system that we're basically now pushing every single planetary boundary. So there's 4, and 4 which are very meta and I have no real confidence in. But I think at this stage, to be honest, there's probably no conclusive answer to this.
Was it a month or 2 ago, Caesar published an event called something on the lines of Who's Creating Existential Risk and Why? And Luke and a couple of other researchers were on there, as I recall. And when you were asked, so like, can we get some names? Who is creating existential risk and why? Maybe it was just my read on it, but you seemed to kind of speak like there was somebody off camera holding your kids hostage. Like, it was clearly not a comfortable question. And, so I'm just wondering, on your discussions of power concentrations, how easy is it to deal with these kinds of questions in the field at the moment?
In trying to pass this over to me again, so I wasn't a member of that panel. I guess for me, what I'm trying to think, what is it that would make me call out something very particular? And yeah, again, it just comes back to this thing we've been saying about drivers and systems that actually trying to pinpoint an individual action as that's the thing, right? It is missing the point. and but who do we start to blame for the the systems? A lot of that is, I think, targeting our state and our governments and kind of explaining to them why the policies that they're following, you can see clearly in the pandemic, these sort of short-term policies are not the effective way to handle this. They're not the effective way to handle it for the whole of the, the kind of international community, and they're not the effective way to handle it for us as an individual state either. But yeah, I think that's probably it. I think it comes down very much to the individual working in these areas. It's how you choose to relate to various actors. That's probably where I'd target it. Although again, there's just some general awareness raising things, so it's not kind of trying to blame all scientists and say, "Oh, you're doing the bad stuff." How can we help you to understand where there might be risks associated with your work and how you might respond to them?
Yeah, I would agree that there's always an ability to go to a high level here. So we can, of course, say that climate change is in large part due to the fossil fuel industry, and you can name certain companies like ExxonMobil or BP.
Oh, today's sponsor. No, I'm kidding. That's just...
and that, of course, you can then go beyond that and say, well, these companies are being driven by a profit motive and they're operating within a particular kind of state-based system, etc. We can then, of course, go to this very meta level of, extractive hierarchies and Rhodes dynamics, etc., environmental externalities. I think both can be true, right? So you can both have incentives, and you can also have particular actors who are, again, reaping the benefits from pursuing those incentives, but also reinforcing them as well. And one of the uses of focusing upon actors, it's actually, I think, quite a useful leverage point. If you look at like Facebook, when it has actually changed its behavior, it's when it's been threatened quite clearly in terms of its reputation, its bottom line. And likewise with the fossil fuel industry as well. You've gotten the biggest rise of them when it comes to things like divestment campaigns and whatnot, mainly because they're afraid to lose their social license to operate and hence become regulated. And so if you are going to change the overlying incentives, you have to kind of change the power network, and kind of naming and shaming is one useful part of that. And of course, it's still accurate in some way, even if they are prone to certain incentives, which are partly under the control, I think. And in terms of whether this is like easy and the whole awkwardness of sometimes talking about this, I mean, of course, it's much easier to talk in an abstract sense or to work with power than to work against it, particularly when it comes to certain actors. I think that if you're an existential risk, it's fairly easy to talk about, again, ExxonMobil, BP, even potentially Boeing and the kind of major arms manufacturers, Northrop Grumman, etc. Those are like fairly unequivocally bad actors. I think it's much more when you get into ones which are more dual use, or particularly ones which provide funding into the field. So I'm thinking here of big tech, for instance, that suddenly it becomes very, very awkward to talk about that. And I think this is part of the bigger political economy issue of the field, that the field is disproportionately funded and supported by philanthropy from big tech donors. And I think that's probably been done for a particular reason, that the visions of the future that are spoken about in existential risk, particularly from people like Nick Bostrom, clearly align with the visions of the future that people like Peter Thiel and Elon Musk have. But you don't want to piss off your donors usually, which makes it much less, what's what I'm looking for here? Easy, I guess, to talk about particular actors when it comes to the actors who are supporting your field.
I think there's a question here about working within the systems that be, and just like getting better at the game than like the existential risk like actors or the agents of doom, to use Luke your terminology, and versus like trying to either pit different systems against each other, like trying to get really good at changing policy to then manage the sort of corporate interest more effectively, or vice versa, even though I don't exactly know how that would work in an ethical way. But what are sort of some of the general approaches to dealing with this issue? If both Catherine and Luke, you both agree that there are a set of institutions that might be hard to pin down in the more like vague like situations, but if you do nonetheless think that there is a smaller group of these major X risk like drivers, what are some of the effective strategies, or what are some of the strategies that researchers or policymakers or just young people who are interested in like getting into X risk can start researching or start getting involved in, or what have you?
Go on, this time I'll put it to you first, Luke.
Okay. Fair enough. I think this depends upon both how fundamental you think the change in institutions is required, and also how you think change is usually best achieved. And of course, those two interact. So you can think that in normal circumstances, change is best achieved through working with existing power structures, but to fundamentally change an institution, you'll usually need to work outside of it, because most institutions kind of don't want to either be destroyed or kind of fundamentally change in some way. So first of all, this does rely upon, I think, your assumptions politically as an individual. And this is something we don't talk about enough in the field, is that there's a whole bunch of assumptions about things like human nature and about politics that really heavily determine whether you're going to take an inside versus outside strategy. To me, being quite clear about kind of my underlying beliefs and motivations, I think that the changes that are required in the long term actually are quite deep and fundamental. They probably require a very different form of democracy, a much more direct, democratic, and deliberative one. They probably require very different distributions of power and wealth going into the future, and that requires very deep and fundamental change in our both political and economic structures.
Yeah.
And I think precisely. And I think when you've seen those big shifts throughout history, they've tended to be much more from the bottom up and from kind of distributed action rather than from kind of individuals working from inside in elite institutions. Of course, there's always kind of a combination of the two to some extent. But I think that it's highly unlikely that this is going to be solved by sending people into the Pentagon and hoping that the elites of the military basically listen to us when we talk about existential risk. I think that the brunt of the action is going to be actually changing the way the public thinks and how they hold power to account.
Yes, I'm going to say I think it's another one of these difficult questions, because there's these sort of things. To what extent do we need to, or will it be useful to work with some of these actors to achieve the change that we want? Yeah. Versus at the same time thinking the system as itself is going to need to change. And that's, I think it can alter within different kind of aspects of what you work on. There may be some things where you can see that there's a very kind of quick policy change that might be an easy sell. I can probably work with a government actor to get them to go with that. And so in those cases, you do want a cooperative relationship. But there may be other things where you're just, the solution is not going to be through you. It's going to be too radical. How do we work out what the other options are, and how do we maybe support actors in that sort of area as well? And I think, again, for a lot of the community, that's that question of how much they're going to be an activist, which I think, it cuts across other academic fields as well, is, to what extent is being an activist compatible with the kind of tradition of being an academic? Probably not, but then that's not, I think, what people go into this field for, right? They don't go into this field thinking, I'm going to be a traditional academic. They are people who are wanting to make a difference.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And I think ultimately you always want to balance between different approaches. Like, I have colleagues who work on some of these very short-term tractable issues that Catherine's mentioned, like, don't hook up your nuclear weapon systems to machine learning. And, I'm very happy for people to go on the inside to get a short-term win like that. And that just seems like an unequivocal good. And that doesn't require fundamental change in the way the institutions work. But ultimately you need both. And if you are taking a kind of long-term perspective, you really need to have that focus on activism as well. And I think that sometimes we probably fool ourselves into thinking that there's a really sharp trade-off between these different roles. When you look at the climate space, for instance, scientists have been quite effective at both doing good scientific work, being respected and credible for that, being activists, and also occasionally even advising governments and whatnot. If you look at someone like Kevin Anderson, for instance, incredibly well-respected energy systems modeler and climatologist. Also very regularly involved with the Climate Change Council. And also on top of that is an incredibly kind of outspoken adversary of the government and advocate for both activism and large-scale change. So I think that these roles are less in tension than we often think they are.
Why do you think that's not more talked about within the field and just within politics more broadly? Those are two massively different questions, so we can stick to the first one for now. I keep asking questions with you guys where like I'll get excited trying to explain it and like simultaneously try to explain it to the audience and also like a format as a question. It just creates a really kind of mangled mess of a bunch of different questions, but nonetheless, just keep it straightforward. Why don't you think this is more talked about? Why is this so neglected?
So I'm going to go back to you, Coleman, and just ask you to sort of draw out that question. So what is it you...
I overcorrected, dang.
That's right.
Yeah, why? I'm really interested in understanding more areas of the field that are sort of neglected, right? Perspectives, whether it's underlying political perspectives, underlying economic assumptions, or human nature is one that human nature and human motivation are two of the things I formally study. But in terms of why we don't talk more about what Luke was just discussing in terms of existential threats and working within the system versus working outside the system, and the sort of intellectual activist like combination that seems to be pretty effective with, what was the name of the climate scientist or climate advocate slash like intellectual, or what was his name again?
So it's currently Kevin Edison there, but there's a whole bunch of other people like Michael Mann, for instance, Farhani Amin, etc.
But that approach to intellectualism is different than at least what like I kind of feel like is more broadly adhered to within academia, which is one of the beautiful, unique aspects of existential risk. But why is that not talked more about? Because that seems like such a massive thing of importance, both in terms of effective approach to the field and also effective benefits to the field in terms of getting more people involved.
I mean, a partial answer is that I guess I feel that it is starting to be discussed and being discussed, but that may not be permeating outside of certain groups. So I think within CSER, certainly over the last few years, and again, as people have joined from other disciplines and they've already got these kind of critical perspectives on things that they can kind of bring across. So, for example, kind of questioning using security frameworks and what impacts that has. So I do think that discussion is going on, but I mean, you raising the question makes me go, oh, but that discussion is clearly not permeating outwards. So it's not seen that there are those sort of discussions going on. And I think that would be useful for people to see, because again, it's that a lot of people will be motivated, not kind of thinking, right, the way I must deal with these issues of existential risk is I must become an academic. I must do it in a scholarly way. They will have different ways they might want to do this. And knowing that that's kind of, that is part of it, thinking there are different routes to achieving these things.
For 21st Talks, the approach is I like Right Ideas, which is just like public communication and public education. Right Approach, which is talking about it in the right way. That's more sort of public comm, but like sort of psychologically based in terms of like motivation. And the other big one is art and trying to get that ethos side. Because that's kind of been the issue with, luckily, studying like academic philosophy. Like, there's a big PR issue in philosophy. So that's something that the field hasn't exactly grappled with, but something that I've been really interested in figuring out and solving for quite a while. And it's not the exact same issue for existential risk by any extent, but nonetheless, you're absolutely right, so many more ways for people to be involved and take action, which is one of the reasons why it's like sometimes tricky to explain to guests who are coming on and be like, yeah, like I want to talk to you about like engineering ethics and like explain how that's like deeply connected to this field, or like I want to have like an artist come on and I have to explain to them like, no, the way you're telling stories today like there is important ideas embedded in what you're doing beyond just understanding what life is like in the 21st century, because to change behavior you have to meet people where they're at, but nonetheless there's this like massive issue of I think not really communicating to people that like you can do existential risk art, and that can be like as impactful as becoming a highly credited researcher. Hell, do both, and that would be even cooler. But nonetheless, there is so many more ways to take action than we typically think.
Yeah. I mean, picking up on that and upon Catherine's answer there, I think that there's, in any given kind of epistemic community, in other words, community of researchers, there's a dominant ideology usually. And in this case, it's hard to overlook, of course, that existential risk is very closely bonded up with other communities like long-termism, like affective altruism. And there is certainly an unstated theory of change there. And it's one of you work with power, you work within these existing institutions, etc. And there's probably a whole bunch of different explanations for why that is, ranging from kind of founders' effects. So the people who initially were really heavily involved with the initial field were kind of more fond of that approach. And so hence it's just kind of percolated and filtered through to just something like, psychologically it's much easier and sexier to work with power than to work against it. It's both easy to get funding, but also, it's just generally speaking easy to go and speak to a politician. It's more rewarded in terms of your career and profile than going and speaking to a bunch of activists or getting yourself arrested or anything like that.
You tend to get served more caviar as well. And I feel like that definitely, we can't overlook the caviar incentive.
Oh yeah, the food is definitely better. Yeah, not to mention, and beyond that, of course, there is a political economy to these things. So, Kevin Anderson and most of the other academics we've spoken about, they clearly have their money from government sources and sources which are not going to mind too much if they're involved with fairly aggressive adversarial activism. But again, the field has different funding sources which may be less welcoming towards that kind of approach and that kind of theory of change. So it's hard to disentangle, but there's probably both ideological and kind of economic reasons as to why one theory of change currently dominates.
And on that point, can either of you give any advice on how to involve people who aren't really, who's probably never heard of existential risk, into at least making it maybe 5% of their lives, because I still have no idea how I should explain to my parents, I mean, nobody votes on the basis of which party has the better AI policy, and I'm just outside of the obvious thing, climate. Everyone votes on climate now. Besides that, I mean, have you had any success? What's worked for you? What hasn't worked?
Yeah, so I this is not something I've particularly tried, persuading people. I guess again because I've been in a centre where people just come along because they are interested. That's kind of not needed. And I guess there's the thing of thinking, how many people do need to be actually involved in this core, and how many. So I'm more interested, and I think you may be pointing towards this. It's not that people have to join and feel they identify as part of this existential risk community, but it's if they're working on other things like disaster communication, risk communication, modelling of certain things, systems modelling, for example, that they can see that there's somewhere they can make a contribution. They can kind of go, oh yeah, I'm doing something that's of value to you. I can share it with you. It's going to be of use, rather than having to feel that you are definitely part of this community. I'm not sure that really answers your question that much, Nathaniel.
Yeah, there seems to be, correct me if I'm wrong here, Nathaniel, there seems to be almost two questions bound up here. So one around, in terms of research, how do you convince people to spend more time focusing on existential risk? And then secondly, in terms of politics, how do you get people to take existential risk more seriously and potentially change their voting patterns, etc. on the basis of it? And for the former, I agree with Catherine.
Just getting anyone to care.
Right. I think for other researchers, most of them do, and it's actually a fairly cool topic. And if they can have time, they actually do like spending time with this. I've been very impressed by how easy it is to get people from complexity science, history, etc., interested in these fairly big questions. And granted, they're often people who have tenure, so hence they don't have to rely upon publish or perish or funding pressures, and they have more scope to look at these big questions. But most people quite enjoy thinking about these really big meta issues, and most people do care about both catastrophe and extinction. In terms of how do you change the everyday person, again, my impression is that when you speak to people about climate change, nuclear war. AGI becomes a bit trickier, but like most of these kind of like fairly plausible things that would cause human extinction, they usually find it quite interesting. The main blockage to me seems to often be a sense of disempowerment or despondency of, well, these things are beyond my control. So what's the point of me either learning about them, going into the research of them, changing my voting patterns on the basis of them? That shifted a little bit with climate change, but I think it's been less so when it comes to things like nuclear war or dangerous technologies, etc. How you shift that, I'm not entirely sure. And if I knew, I'd probably be doing a different job.
I was actually wondering, that second part about the more political and how you might get people to vote and that sort of thing. I think it maybe speaks back to what Luke was saying earlier about that not kind of focusing on a particular hazard. So getting a political party that's going to do what we want for kind of every one of these hazards is going to be unlikely, and people will vote differently and that sort of thing. But if you have a party coming forward who could hopefully say something about building more resilient systems and being able to respond better to whichever risks it faces. I mean, particularly, I'm thinking the UK at the moment, if you had a government that could say, yeah, we're not going to end up with shortages in the supply chains, we're just going to make it resilient to anything that could impact it and that sort of thing. So there might be some sort of window of opportunity here as well. But yeah, I think that might be more of the, getting people to care about the wider thing of resilience rather than kind of getting them to care about individual hazards maybe.
I suppose that's like when it comes to the sort of psychology of our time, it's there's a lot of really, really fascinating literature on just like existential motivation today. And specifically the sort of approach that I'm really interested in like developing and cultivating for 21st Talks, but also sort of more broadly as a way to get people engaged in existential risk work is meaning orientation. And the idea behind that is if you show people that a lack of purpose and a sense of not having like a why today is not only endemic, but it's also deeply, deeply fatalism driving. And the issue with fatalism is absolutely the biggest stunt for any will, for any action, right? When you feel fatalistic and pessimistic, you don't try to do something typically. And because of that, I think there's this massive requirement for us to kind of connect existential risk work to a sense of purpose and a sense of meaning. And I think through that can involve community. But Catherine, as you were saying earlier, it doesn't necessarily need to mean identification with the community. But at the bare minimum, I think it requires two things: identification of the issue and understanding, like good understanding of the issue. And secondly, efficacy, right? What Luke was discussing. And it seems like a lot of policy issues and government issues come down to the fact that it's easy when you're within a large system to not have any sense of power within that. Like I'm thinking about like things I've heard about people who are really involved in different like UN discussions and sort of like backroom discussions and stuff, saying that like the people who are literally like controlling the finances of like entire countries feel like they can't really do much sometimes. Which is a very, very, like, even the powerful feel disempowered, wrongly in a lot of cases. But it's something that you see sort of across society, across sort of power structures, is this sense of like a lack of efficacy. So is that a barrier to like effective policy work, both from the bottom up, but also like from the people who are like in the institutions themselves? Because it seems like that is almost like a aspect of how the institutions don't change. Is like you get people to the top and you say, you can't actually do anything, sorry.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a barrier to the bottom up. I think, again, despondency and disempowerment are some of the biggest barriers we have to active political engagement. And God, I even find it influencing myself sometimes. Yeah. From the top down, it's hard to tell, because I've definitely seen that as well from my own time in climate negotiations. My feeling is that when you have not much power, you tend to try to project it. So when you look at like the earliest kings and of city-states in Mesopotamia, they made it out that they were very close to gods, at the very least emblems and kind of representatives of gods. And, they always tried to, in some way, basically glorify their violent conquests and their power. And you have quite the opposite today, where like states have an enormous amount of power compared to any other polity in the past, and yet they tend to do exactly the opposite, which is often a downplaying what we're capable of, etc. And I think this is both useful in terms of, if everyone thinks you don't have a lot of power, you're less likely to be regulated, you're less likely to be targeted. And on top of that, it just provides a really good excuse for not taking action, basically. So if you're a fossil fuel company saying, oh, unfortunately, just the shareholders, they just higher, they've got this really big pressure on us, so we can't really change our ways. That becomes a really good excuse for actions that actually justify the most powerful on top. So, yeah, I guess I'm more skeptical of the idea that the top down, the biggest, most powerful actors in the world are really as disempowered as they may say they are sometimes.
Yeah, I wasn't suggesting that they actually are in reality, but I'm saying that the sense of the sense of efficacy, right? That measurement does affect their behavior. It's funny because I think of the super wealthy kid of a CEO or something walking into my 9 a.m. class wearing like shoes that are super scuffed up and whatever, and then the student who comes from a background more similar to mine, wearing the nicest thing possible coming in. There's a really interesting kind of the less powerful you tend to be, the more you sometimes try to project. So that's a really interesting idea. But nonetheless, Catherine, what do you think?
I don't have any kind of great insight on this. I guess I wonder whether sometimes as well this kind of whole lack of efficacy is being used as an excuse for inaction. I couldn't have done anything really, so why should I have tried? But also,
sorry.
Oh no, just the other thing I think is the ease of blame shifting that goes on as well. So sort of looking at the pandemic, the way in which states kind of go, it's the World Health Organization's fault, and you go, but the World Health Organization is made up of member states, so it's kind of the handing off of it. I guess I can understand that with anyone. If you're in a position of power, but and responsibility, you want to be a bit away from the accountability thing. And so by going to say, well, I can't really do anything, it kind of shifts that from you. And I guess it would be interesting to get some kind of this psychology of leadership and knowing about that. Because you kind of go, okay, that was probably a very human response, but it's possibly not a particularly helpful one.
Yeah, our ability to conveniently believe the right things to excuse ourselves morally is uncanny as a species. And it's quite, in this case, it's existential.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I wonder how much of this also becomes distorted or sometimes amplified by structures. So states, when you look at the kind of things that they're expected to do in terms of prioritizing their citizens, basically glorifying their own image, giving very little to helping international causes, at least you're looking at it in terms of percent of GDP, etc. It's kind of exactly the opposite of what we expect from good people, basically, where we tend to expect them to be modest, to be incredibly altruistic, to be frugal, etc., to be brave, to be self-sacrificing. And the way that we tend to expect power structures to operate is almost exactly the opposite. It's almost hard to think of a heroic state, right? One which actually actively tries to do large-scale sacrifices for the benefit of the wider globe. And yet you can find those on an individual level all the time. So there does seem to be sometimes distortions in kind of psychology and purpose, etc., that happens as you amalgamate people and put in place certain kinds of structures, which I guess is to be expected as well.
Yeah, that's brutal. Are you guys good on time? Should we move to the closing questions real quick?
Sure.
Okay, that sounds good. So out of one of the big things I really like to ask is either affirmed statements or just questions you both have relating to other sort of neglected questions or perspectives. Questions you either personally want to get into in future research or just things that you think ERS as a larger field would be really benefited by asking. And it might just be the ones that we've already talked about today, but I just wanted to pose that real quick. What are some neglected questions in existential risk right now?
Sure. So I don't know necessarily how neglected these are, but I think there's a few things that particularly interest me, and particularly in the context of governance again at the moment. One is this thing we were mentioning about the systemic nature of risks. and how do we design governance systems that can map onto that? I think that's going to be a challenge, but I don't think it's an unachievable one. So I think that's a good one to look at. One that's kind of been lingering for me for several years, and I think is also important, is dealing with the issues of trust and equity. Again, this speaks to some of the drivers we've been talking about. Again, I think this is some of the things about the powerful and less powerful. So yeah, there are some states out there who probably have a genuine excuse for not being able to achieve very much. And then I think an interesting one that I don't yet know how to address, but I think is looking down to the local level. So yeah, I mean, I focus on global governance, international community, and that sort of thing, but actually in responding to catastrophic events, what happens at the local level is probably going to really matter in terms of our abilities to kind of cope and recover. And I think that one is going to be something that's neglected within the field currently. And again, it might partly be because people working on that don't find an easy way to kind of match it up. So that would be an interesting thing to think about.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, so I'd agree with those, particularly the idea of focusing upon justice and equity and the relationship between those and resilience and risk. Another one is understanding how the epistemic landscape influences existential risk. So both the issue of secrecy hazards, so how different areas of secrecy and ignorance can actually allow certain risks to basically go cultivated without being accountable or regulated. But also, of course, there are information hazards as well, and understanding those information that becomes widely dispersed could be dangerous. I think secrecy is more of an issue than information hazards, but both coexist and both part of kind of a broader spectrum of what's the knowledge landscape that is likely to produce existential risk, which ones aren't. And apart from that, I think a really interesting one is also looking at something like democracy and existential risk. So understanding how more democratic forms of decision-making potentially increase or decrease existential risk. And I think on the latter, of course. And I think also this is less about neglect and more about revision, but some of our very basic tools and definitions of the field need drastic reconsideration. The very definition of existential risk. I mean, for one, I'm not very comfortable with defining existential risk as a inability to reach technological maturity. Technological maturity meaning maximum control over nature and economic productivity. And I think we can do much better in terms of finding value neutral and more precise definitions. And again, finding frameworks that go beyond thinking about individual hazards and thinking much more about systems of risks and risk as emergent behavior.
Yeah. Right now I'm working on a series of like key ideas in existential risk, like explained, just like short snippets. And that is, thank you so much for that, because like that's gonna be really influential in terms of trying to really devalue, try to understand what values I'm projecting into the definitions, or that the definitions hold themselves, because it does put another barrier to people getting involved, right? Especially like if you put like a political edge on it, it's like immediately discounts like 50% of the US. Like it just immediately erases that. So there's but I think by focusing on the meaning of it and the personal power of it, I think that is very agreeable to a lot of people in today's world. So I think a lot of people are looking for that, are desiring that.
And the biggest one, I think, actually is the question that Nathaniel asked earlier of what are the drivers of the current political economy and power networks that cause existential risk. And I think a kind of subset of that is a really interesting question of how much is just historically contingent? How much of just the fact that we end up with a weird system of nation states after colonization, which was due to a whole bunch of historically contingent factors, and how much of it is potentially due to much more longue durée dynamics of how power and societies operate.
Oh, that's such an interesting point. Yeah. Finally, like what, just as broadly as possible, like what would you say humanity's odds are for surviving the century? And are you do you have rational reasons to be optimistic, or rational reasons to be incredibly pessimistic right now. I think I can predict what Luke's answer will be, but Catherine, I would really love to hear yours. I'd love to hear both of yours, but
well, it's asked a similar question. I think again at the end of an interview a few years ago. I gave my response, and then they were like, "Yeah, we were asking for your optimistic view." So yeah, that was it. So in terms of humanity surviving the century, I think the odds are fairly good. I think we'll be able to kind of, whether it's by luck more than anything else, push off some of the more kind of existential threats. However, I don't think it's going to be a good century for most of humanity. I think the things we're facing, climate change is a real big one. Those things we're facing are going to cause a lot more suffering over that period. And so, yeah, strangely optimistic, I guess, to say I think there's going to be a load of suffering, but we'll get through it. But I think that's probably where I feel the kind of realistic position is.
Yeah.
Catherine and I keep on aligning too much on these questions. Basically the same. I don't like to put precise probabilities in these things. I don't have a crystal ball. I think you can instead view it more as a barometer. So you can think about the pressures that are likely to result in larger risk. And unfortunately, I think most of those are getting worse. Things like increasing inequality over time, the fact that we can't seem to get a good handle upon race dynamics and dangerous technological developments. I think it's highly unlikely that we'll go extinct by the end of the century. We're incredibly resilient, both at an individual level and as a species. And when you look at the disaster risk management literature, one of the things it shows for is even the most dire kind of disasters, people respond to quite effectively. So that gives me some hope of at least making it through the century. I think the bigger issue is, again, these kind of long-term structural trends, which appear to be getting worse over the long term. And unless we learn how to change those over not this century, but many centuries, it's hard not to have a grim view.
Yeah, so sort of just a slow fuzzling out of humanity's potential. Yeah, I can see why the definitions of existential risk need to be reevaluated, if that's the case, right? But nonetheless, Nathaniel, what's yours, actually? I've never asked you. I've never had, for how long we've been friends, I feel like I would have asked you this by now. But yeah, what about you, Nathaniel?
Yeah, I echo the heavy suspicion for precise numerical probabilities. I'm not sure I can say much that'll reflect on the actual world rather than my particular sort of psychological hang-ups. I suppose I think the actual odds of humanity going extinct specifically by 2100, very, very uncertain, but presumably not massive. However, I think it is far larger than it needs to be, and I am very worried about the resolution of this driver problem, because it seems like either we keep on going with these underlying drivers that keep on generating new possible sources of existential risk, or we get rid of them somehow. And these drivers all seem like the kind of things that you don't get rid of without a period of massive instability and risk. It's I don't know, do we either run out the clock and wait for one of those dice rolls to eventually count the wrong way, or do we run the gauntlet? I hope those aren't the only two options, because neither of them sound good. But yeah, I suppose if I thought there wasn't a real big risk, I wouldn't be going into this field.
What then? This is the final question. What about our odds for collective flourishing and the prospect of being on the path for building a better world? And off of what everyone has just said, and my personal beliefs as well, it seems like the odds for collective flourishing are quite low. But in terms of where people can focus if they want to increase flourishing the most this century, is that even a good question to ask? Because now I'm starting to think maybe the question shouldn't be collective human flourishing, but just collective human living and as much equitable existence as possible. It's so much more basic than flourishing, it seems. So is flourishing something that's worthy of shooting for this century? Like widespread flourishing for people, or should we just make sure that, like, does it make more sense to focus on just making sure people don't starve to death in the millions, i.e. the number of the 340 million that was just reported today at COP26, saying if we have a 2-degree temperature rise from climate change, and right now we're on track for a 2.7, so it's not looking good. So flourishing or just baseline human survival this century?
Absolutely, shoot for flourishing.
Okay.
I mean, like, shoot for the stars, you may not reach them, kind of shoot for flourishing. But also, I think it comes back to one of the answers I gave earlier, when that's kind of, well, is it the technology or is it the systems and things? Well, I guess I would say to people, if you want to move towards this focus and achieving collective flourishing, then maybe stop trying to look at how to fix the technology aspects and look at how to fix our systems, respond to some of these drivers and that sort of thing. I have no idea of the figures of this, but if you're putting your resources, we've got the technologies to solve a lot of the problems you're pointing to, getting people clean water and sanitation. Do that. So let's spend some real time and devote a lot of resources to fixing the other parts.
Yeah, I think so much of this hinges upon how you define flourishing. So a lot of people, when they hear the term flourishing, imagine an interstellar civilization with remarkable degrees of technology. To me, I would very happily settle for everyone having access to plumbing, gender and economic equality, and everyone living in proper democracies. And we'll see what happens from there. And I don't think that the two are in tension between surviving versus having that kind of flourishing, having just a fairly basic degree of justice and equality. Sure. And I think that realistically, maybe the two go hand in hand. That if you're looking to change these underlying political systems and actually create ones which produce less risk, they're probably also going to be ones that are more equal and more fair.
Exactly, right? And which also, I think that answer is true for both, regardless of if the perspective is, let's really focus on omnicidal actors and all these potential, individual, people in small groups that might set off synthetic bioweapons and all these other issues, and also the group that this conversation is a lot more in line with it, which is the systematic and also sort of super powerful, being the ones who bear the most weight and responsibility. I think both of those camps, I feel, your answer is agreeable to, right? Is I think people would agree if omnicidal actors are the things that we should focus on. Even though I don't necessarily agree, I think that it makes more sense to say there's going to be less omnicidal actors if people are content and given proper dignity by their government and have a sense of efficacy within their government systems and aren't starving. I think human flourishing is in line with optimizing the chances for human survival. And I think that's a cause that everyone can get behind. Thank you guys so much for coming on. This was so much fun.
Our pleasure. Thanks, Coleman.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, there you guys have it. That was our interview with Luke Kemp and Catherine Rhodes on governing global catastrophic risks and existential risks, given our incredibly chaotic political system. In addition to that, a very, very messy international stage for these really important discussions to take place on. So thank you guys so much for listening. Thank you, Luke. Thank you, Catherine. And of course, thank you, Nathaniel, so much for being an absolute wonderful, splendid co-host for this episode. It was lovely having you as a co-pilot to steer into a messy cloud of discussion and analysis. So I'm looking forward to more in the future. As for the audience, thank you guys so much for listening. Remember to like, rate, and subscribe, and leave some feedback on what you think of this episode. My apologies about the sound quality. It was quite a silly mistake. That will not be happening again. So I appreciate you guys bearing with it throughout this episode. And we'll be back with high def audio quality for all the participants, myself included, next week. And until then, please remember to subscribe to us on Patreon if you can afford $1 or $2 each month to support what we're doing here. Check out some of our articles. Check out Luke's article down below, along with some of Catherine's research. And if you guys have any questions, concerns, or anything you want to throw at us for a Q&A session, let us know. You can tweet us. You can also send us an email at contactcolemanSnell@gmail.com. So yeah, thank you guys so much, and I'll see you guys next week.